My Emile tried to marry my husband off to her friend's daughter, by filing a marriage license without his knowledge. She thought it would be valid, until the court called him to confirm, and he had her charged with forgery. My mother-in-law tried to erase me from my own marriage. Not just figuratively, literally. She actually filed a marriage license for my husband to marry another woman. Without his knowledge. Without his consent. She forged his signature, submitted the paperwork, and genuinely thought it would go through because, in her words, the courts don't actually check these things. She thought she'd get away with it. She thought she could replace me. And for a brief, terrifying moment, she almost did. Let me start from the beginning. My husband, Mark, and I have been married for 3 years, together for 6. His mother, Susan, has never liked me. Not in the passive-aggressive comments kind of way, more in the, "You're ruining my son's life and I will do everything in my power to get rid of you" kind of way. She made it clear from day one that I wasn't good enough. Wrong background. Wrong upbringing. Wrong everything. When we first started dating, she tried to act civil. Smiled through clenched teeth, made forced conversation, and played the role of the supportive mother, in front of Mark. But the second we were alone, she would drop little comments. "You know he can do better, right?" Or, "I just don't see this lasting." Then came the setups. At family gatherings, she'd introduce him to single women. "Oh, this is Rachel. She's an architect. Isn't that amazing? You two should talk." All while I was standing right there. Mark always shut it down. He made it clear he wasn't interested. That he was with me. That he loved me. But Susan? She wasn't listening. Even after we got married, she still brought up better options. Always casual, always innocent. "I just ran into Claire. You remember Claire, right? She's single now. It's such a shame you two never worked out." Mark ignored it. I ignored it. It was annoying, but manageable. Until a few months ago. Mark got a phone call from the county clerk's office. They needed to confirm his upcoming marriage. At first, he thought it was a scam. A mistake. Something stupid. "We have a marriage license filed for you and Jessica M." the clerk said. "We just need verbal confirmation before finalizing it." Mark's stomach dropped. "Who?" he asked. Jessica M. was a name he didn't recognize. A total stranger. "There must be some kind of error," Mark said. "I'm already married." The clerk hesitated. "Well, sir, we have your signature on file. Are you saying you didn't sign this document?" Mark asked for a copy. They emailed it to him. And sure enough, there was his name, his personal information, his forged signature. Filed just 2 weeks earlier. He called me immediately. I could barely understand what he was saying because he was talking so fast, so panicked. I kept asking him to slow down, but all I could make out was, "Someone tried to marry me off." When I saw the document, my blood ran cold. It was perfectly filled out. Every detail about Mark was correct. His full legal name, his birth date, his social security number. It wasn't sloppily done. Whoever forged this knew exactly what they were doing. Mark called his mother. She picked up on the first ring, chipper as ever. "Hi, sweetheart. What the hell did you do?" Silence. Then, a light chuckle. "Mark, honey, what are you talking about?" he told her. The phone was on speaker, and I could hear the exact moment she stopped pretending. Her voice went cold. Flat. "I did what needed to be done," she said. I felt my stomach twist. She admitted it. No hesitation. No shame. Like it was the most normal thing in the world. "You're making a mistake with her," Susan said. "I just fixed it for you." Mark was shaking. "You committed fraud. Don't be dramatic," she scoffed. "It's not legally binding yet. The courts don't actually check these things, you know. You could have just gone along with it, and saved yourself a messy divorce." She had planned everything. She had convinced a family friend's daughter, Jessica, to marry Mark. Jessica was in on it. She knew. She agreed to it. All Susan needed was for the paperwork to go through. And if Mark hadn't answered that call, if the court hadn't double-checked, it would have. Mark went ballistic. He told her she was insane. That she had no right. That he would never forgive her for this. She laughed. "You're overreacting," she said. "You'll thank me when you realize what a mistake you made with." Mark hung up. We sat in silence for a long time. Then he did what I never thought he'd actually do. He called the police. We submitted everything. The forged document, the emails, even the call log from the county clerk confirming that she had filed the paperwork herself. Susan wasn't just an overbearing mother. She wasn't just being controlling. She committed a crime. Forgery. Fraud. intent to falsify a legal document. And now, the police were involved. But the worst part? Susan still doesn't think she did anything wrong. Susan had no idea that Mark actually followed through with calling the police. She must have thought he was bluffing, that her little plan would just blow over like every other scheme she pulled. But this time? This time, it was different. The police took this very seriously. They told us that forging a legal document, especially something as significant as a marriage license, was a felony in our state. They asked Mark to come in and make a formal statement, and he didn't hesitate. He brought everything: the fake marriage license, the emails from the county clerk, even the call logs showing that they had reached out to him for verification. After he gave his statement, one of the officers looked at him and said, "We're not just dealing with forgery here. There's something bigger going on." Mark and I exchanged a look. Bigger how? The officer sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It looks like your mother had help. Someone at the courthouse pushed this application forward without the usual verification steps." I felt my stomach drop. Mark was stunned. "Wait, you're saying she had an inside person at the clerk's office?" The officer nodded. "We're looking into it now, but we think someone intentionally tried to fast-track this marriage license." The room went completely silent. That was when it hit me: Susan had connections. She had always bragged about knowing people in high places. We thought it was just her usual nonsense, but now it looked like she had actually used those connections to try to pull this off. Mark ran a hand through his hair. "So, what happens now?" The officer was quiet for a moment before saying, "We need to bring her in for questioning." Later that evening, Susan called Mark, acting like nothing had happened. Like she hadn't just tried to erase our marriage. "Sweetheart, I made dinner. You should come over." Mark just stared at his phone, his jaw clenched so tight I thought he might break his teeth. He put her on speaker. "Susan," he said coldly, "do you understand what you've done?" "Oh, for God's sake." She sighed, annoyed. "Are we still talking about that? You're acting like I murdered someone. It was a simple mistake. It didn't even go through." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. She sounded bored. Like she was tired of the conversation already. "You forged a legal document," Mark snapped. "You tried to marry me off. You don't think that's a big deal?" Susan let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, please. The courts barely check these things. If you hadn't been so stubborn, you could have just gone along with it. Divorce her quietly, move on." Mark lost it. "Are you even hearing yourself right now? Do you know what happens to people who commit felony forgery?" Silence. Then, in the calmest voice I'd ever heard him use, he said, "You're going to get a visit from the police soon. You should get a lawyer." And then? He hung up. We thought that would be the end of it, that Susan would finally realize she had gone too far. That she'd at least panic a little. But she didn't. The next morning, Mark got another call. Not from the police. Not from Susan. From Jessica. The woman Susan had tried to marry him off to. Mark didn't even want to answer, but curiosity got the best of him. He put her on speaker. "Mark," Jessica said, her voice shaky. "You need to drop this. Please." Mark and I exchanged a look. "Drop what?" he asked, playing dumb. "The police report," she said. "You don't understand what you're getting into." That was the moment we realized Jessica knew more than she was letting on. Mark narrowed his eyes. "Jessica, why do you care?" Silence. Then, she let out a breath and said something that made my blood run cold. "Because I wasn't supposed to marry you." I sat up straight. Mark stiffened beside me. "What the hell does that mean?" Mark demanded. Jessica hesitated, like she was debating whether to say it out loud. Then, in a hushed voice, she said, "Susan was never planning for me to be a wife. I was just the name she used on the paperwork." I felt my stomach turn. "Then who?" Jessica cut me off. "She was trying to set you up with someone else. Someone you actually know." Mark paled. "Who?" Jessica hesitated. Then, barely above a whisper, she said, "Your ex." I stopped breathing. Mark's ex. The one Susan had always loved. The one she had been begging him to get back together with for years. The one who had moved out of state but had recently come back. Jessica kept talking, her voice shaking. "Susan told me that if I helped push the paperwork through, I'd be taken care of. But I didn't realize until last night that I was never meant to actually marry you. She just needed a temporary name to file the documents. Once everything was legal, she planned to swap in your ex and say the paperwork got mixed up." I felt like I was going to be sick. Mark clenched his fists. "Where's my mother now?" Jessica swallowed hard. "I don't know. But you need to be careful. She's not done yet." And then she hung up. Mark and I sat there in stunned silence, Jessica's last words ringing in our ears. She's not done yet. That was the moment I realized Susan wasn't just desperate. She was dangerous. For the past few weeks, we had been dealing with the fallout of what we thought was a crazy, over-the-top stunt by a controlling mother. But now, it was something else entirely. Susan had faked a marriage license. That alone was insane. But the fact that Jessica was never even supposed to be the real bride? That she was just a placeholder so Susan could sneak in Mark's ex at the last minute? That took it to a whole new level. Mark's ex, Natalie, had always been Susan's dream daughter-in-law. She was polished, came from an upper-class family, and had the right look to be Susan's ideal choice. Susan never got over the fact that Mark broke up with her years ago, and no matter how many times he told her to drop it, she kept bringing Natalie up. So, I wasn't entirely surprised that Susan would still be trying to force them back together. But what I couldn't wrap my head around was, how the hell did she think she could actually make this happen? That's when it hit me. I turned to Mark, my chest tightening. She was planning to forge divorce papers. His face went white. It made too much sense. Susan had already forged a marriage license. Why wouldn't she take it a step further? If her goal was to make Mark legally single before the wedding, then all she had to do was file fake divorce papers behind our backs. If she had an inside connection at the courthouse helping her, she might have actually pulled it off. Mark shot up from the couch, his entire body tense. We need to check. We logged into the online case system for our county and started searching. I could barely breathe as I typed in our names. I hit enter. And there it was. A divorce petition had been filed in Mark's name. I let out a sharp gasp. My hands flew to my mouth. Filed just 2 weeks ago. Mark's hands were shaking as he clicked on it. The documents loaded. And sure enough, there was his forged signature. I thought I might pass out. She actually did it. I whispered. Mark was staring at the screen like he couldn't even process it. Then, suddenly, he grabbed his phone and dialed the courthouse. A woman answered. County Clerk's office, how can I help you? My name is Mark, and I need to report a fraudulent divorce filing under my name. His voice was controlled, but I could hear the barely contained rage underneath. There was a pause. Then she said, Oh, are you talking about the case that was just withdrawn? Mark and I froze. What do you mean? He asked slowly. The woman hesitated. That case was pulled this morning. Someone came in and personally withdrew it. My heart started pounding. Who? Mark demanded. Hold on, let me check. She typed for a few seconds. It says here it was withdrawn in person at 8:47 a.m. But the person who signed the withdrawal form wasn't you. It was a woman named Natalie. I swear my vision blurred. Mark staggered backward, gripping the table. Natalie? He echoed. The woman on the phone kept talking, completely oblivious to the fact that our entire world was shattering. Yes. She showed up with proper ID and proof of representation. She claimed she was acting on behalf of the petitioner. Mark cut her off. That's impossible. I never authorized her to act on my behalf. The clerk hesitated. I don't know what to tell you. She had documentation. We assumed she was working with your attorney. We didn't have an attorney. And Natalie? She shouldn't have even known about this filing. My head was spinning. Did she say anything else? I blurted out. The woman hesitated. Then, in a careful voice, she said, She mentioned something about fixing a mistake. I had to sit down. Mark ended the call without another word. We stared at each other, both of us realizing the same thing at the exact same time. Natalie had been in on it. Or at the very least, she knew about it. We thought Susan was acting alone, but now it looked like she had help. Natalie had somehow found out that Susan's plan was falling apart. She must have panicked. Maybe she got a heads up from Susan, or maybe she heard about the police investigation and tried to cover her tracks. Either way, she had gone down to the courthouse first thing in the morning to erase the fake divorce before we could catch it. And she almost got away with it. I felt sick. Mark's entire body was stiff. I need to talk to her. I grabbed his arm. Mark, wait. But he was already dialing. He put the phone on speaker. It rang twice. Then she picked up. Mark? Natalie's voice was smooth, too smooth. Like she had been expecting this call. He didn't waste time. What the hell did you do? A long silence. Then she let out a soft laugh. Oh, Mark. You really shouldn't be asking me that. My stomach dropped. Her tone, it was wrong. It wasn't nervous. It wasn't defensive. It was calm. Like she knew something we didn't. Mark's jaw clenched. You went to the courthouse and withdrew a fake divorce that my mother filed. Why? Another pause. Then, in the coldest voice I'd ever heard, she said, "Because, sweetheart, I'm already your wife." The world stopped. I felt like I had been punched in the chest. What? Mark whispered. Natalie sighed, almost bored. Susan took care of everything. You don't need to worry about the details. Just know that legally, on paper, you and I are already married. I felt the blood drain from my face. Mark couldn't even speak. Then Natalie added, almost as an afterthought, "Oh, and your real wife? She's the other woman now." And then she hung up. For a few seconds, Mark and I just stared at each other, completely frozen. You and I are already married. Your real wife? She's the other woman now. I felt my whole body go numb. Mark snapped out of it first. He grabbed his keys, his face unreadable. "We're going to the courthouse." I jumped up. "Mark, we need a lawyer." "No." He cut me off. "We don't have time for that. We need to fix this right now." We got in the car and drove straight to the county clerk's office. Mark didn't speak the entire way, his hands gripping the wheels so hard his knuckles were white. I was shaking, my mind racing. When we got there, we stormed inside. Mark slammed his ID on the counter. "I need to see my marriage records. All of them. Right now." The clerk blinked at us, confused, but after looking at Mark's ID, she nodded and started typing. It only took a few seconds before she frowned at the screen. "That's strange." My stomach twisted. "What?" She turned the monitor toward us. "It shows that you were legally married to your wife 3 years ago." I let out a breath of relief. "See? We're fine, but—" The clerk interrupted. "There's also a second marriage certificate. From 2 weeks ago." The relief vanished. Mark leaned forward. "To who?" The clerk hesitated before saying, "Natalie." I thought I might throw up. Mark's hands curled into fists. "That's not possible. I never signed anything. I never even saw a document." The clerk typed some more, then froze. Oh, this isn't good." "What?" I whispered. She turned the screen again. "It looks like your marriage to your current wife was—" She swallowed. "Annulled." The world tilted. Mark slammed his hand on the counter. "What?" The entire office went silent. The clerk flinched. "Sir, I don't know how this happened, but according to these records, your marriage to your wife was annulled last month, and then a new marriage certificate was filed immediately after." I couldn't breathe. I couldn't breathe. Susan did it. She actually erased our marriage. Mark was seething. His whole body was trembling with rage. "I need to see those documents. Now." The clerk hesitated but eventually printed them out. And there it was. A fake annulment request. A fake marriage certificate. And 2 forged signatures, one for Mark, one for me. I felt my knees go weak. My name had been forged. That meant that, on paper, I was no longer his wife. Mark didn't even hesitate. He grabbed the documents and stormed out. I ran after him. "Mark, where are you going?" He didn't stop. "The police station." And that's exactly what we did. This time, the officers didn't just take our report. They acted immediately. Forgery. Fraud. Conspiracy. And because Susan had faked an annulment and a marriage, it was now a case of identity theft. The moment they saw the documents, they knew this wasn't just a mistake. This was a crime. The police issued a warrant for Susan's arrest. But before they could even get to her, she showed up at our house. There was a loud knock at the door. Not a normal knock, a pounding. Mark opened it. And there she was. Susan. Her face was red with fury. She stormed inside, pushing past him, eyes wild. "How dare you?" Mark crossed his arms. "How dare I what? Report you for a felony?" Susan scoffed. "Oh, don't be ridiculous. I was just fixing a mistake. You would have come to your senses eventually, but now? Now you're trying to send your own mother to jail?" Mark's voice was ice cold. "You belong in jail." Susan's eyes flashed with rage. "For what?" I stepped forward, shaking with anger. "For forging our annulment. For forging a marriage license. For committing identity theft. For—" Susan laughed. Laughed. "Oh, please. No one cares about this kind of thing. The courts barely check these papers." Mark pulled out his phone, pressed play. And Susan's own voice filled the room. "The courts don't actually check these things, you know. You could have just gone along with it, and saved yourself a messy divorce." Susan's face drained of color. Mark had recorded her. She knew she was caught. And right at that moment, the police pulled up. Susan was arrested on the spot. Forgery, fraud, identity theft, the charges stacked up. And then? We got another surprise. The county clerk employee who helped push through the fake paperwork. He was arrested too. Turns out Susan had been bribing him to fast-track the documents. And Natalie? She panicked the second the police got involved. She claimed she had no idea what was going on, that she had just done what Susan told her. But the police didn't buy it. Since she had personally withdrawn the fake divorce, she was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud. In the end, they all faced consequences. Susan went to trial. She tried to play the victim, cried about how she was just trying to help her son. But the evidence was overwhelming. She got sentenced to 5 years for felony forgery and identity fraud. Natalie got probation but lost her job and reputation. And the county clerk employee? Jail time. As for us? The court reversed the fake annulment, and Mark and I were legally reinstated as husband and wife. We cut Susan out of our lives completely. And Mark? He told me, I don't care what it takes, I will never let her near us again. We changed our numbers. We moved. We made sure she could never pull something like this again. Because in the end, Susan didn't just try to break up our marriage. She tried to erase it. And now? She has 5 long years to think about what she did.